Alright, right now I'll be doing a video on Chapter 3 of the Agnostic Inquirer. Alright. So the full argument that is going to be presented and defended throughout the entire book goes as follows. 1. If it is not highly unlikely that a world creator exists, then investigation of the contents of revelatory claims might well show it is probable that a good God exists and has revealed. 2. It is not highly unlikely that a world creator exists. And so 3. Investigations of the content of a revelatory claim might well show it is probable that a good God exists and has revealed, and thus a negative conclusion regarding the existence of a good God is not justified unless the content of a reasonable number of leading revelatory claims has been seriously considered. And so in this chapter we'll be focusing still on the first premise, and how it relates to a good God, the inference of a good God from a world creator. So there are three major questions when it comes to the inference from a world creator to a good God. First, how can the leap from merely a world creator to a good God be justified? Second, what method is there for assessing revelatory claims, and how it relates to being justified in believing in good God? And 3, why think revelatory claims have any explanatory power? So in Chapter 3, which this video is about, we'll be focusing on the first question, and Chapter 4 will be focusing on the second, and Chapter 5 the third. And so the first question relates a lot to the problem of evil. And this is a huge problem, right? Because scientists such as Albert Einstein and great philosophers of the past and even saints deal with it. And so, I mean, it's a very universal problem that many people over the past couple hundred years, even thousands of years, have been invested in. And so, since there's a huge problem regarding it, right, and people have been justifying it through logic, though it really, well, there's a lot of controversy over it, we should still look into Revelation to seek an answer, if there is an answer, regarding this issue. However, before we do that, we need to see if a good God is not, highly unlikely apart from Revelation, right? This goes back to the example of the presumption of natural theology, where you need to fully accept a proposition before going into a basic proposition before going into a more complex one. And the way around this is by noting that the basic proposition and the more complex proposition is not highly unlikely, right? And so that you can be justified in believing both at the same time. So when it comes to Pluto or Uranus, for example, right? Was it Uranus or Neptune? Either one. So first they observed that there was a disturbance, right, at a certain distance, and then they concluded that there was a heavenly body that was disturbing the distance, and there was also a heavenly body beyond a certain distance. Something like that. I probably butchered it a little bit. But so the main thesis is that if you do not think that a possibility is highly unlikely, you can conclude both at the same time. And so we need to show that the possibility of a good God is not highly unlikely, so we can show it as a reasonable explanation of Revelation. If you're confused by this, you can go through my past videos on it. I probably explain it more there. And so the way, as I explained, we can do this is through probabilistic reasoning. So the first category, the first possible way a creator could be is amoral, right? Lacking morality. But why would a creator be amoral? For one, if you follow the argument for a world creator, it seems like the world creator has a mind. Because, well, first, it's immaterial in that it creates all physical things, right? And, minds are the only observed causally efficacious immaterial things we observe, so it seems pretty likely that the creator is a mind. And also, we can conclude, we can show that the likelihood that it is a mind is not really unlikely, because the nature of creation, right? Given, for example, a caveman painting, or a painting in a cave, right, and you know that there is a creator of the cave painting, you deduce that the creator has a mind, or some intellect, if it is complex. Same thing goes on for this world. You might object that the necessity of creation makes it amoral, right? Because you might think that determinism goes against consciousness or a mind. But then you'd have to ask, what grounds necessity of creation in an amoral being? In a good creator, this might be grounded in self-diffusiveness, as many philosophers have said in the past, but it seems unclear about what would ground the necessity of creation in an amoral being. Perhaps the creator is impersonal, but if the creator was impersonal, it makes the creator seem evil because, well, the creator is responsible for creation and intends creation because it has a mind, but really just does not care, and that makes it seem evil. Self-sufficiency, so Aristotle's God, it thinks only about itself, and so it doesn't really, and since it only focuses on the highest good, which is itself, it doesn't really focus on creation. The thing is, thinking about itself would involve relational properties, because, well, the creator is related to the world, and so it'll inevitably think about its creation. Maybe you could say that it's immoral because of independent existence, but then you'd have to explain why this is outside of morality. It's not really clear. Maybe you could say that there are no properties depending on extrinsic things in a creator, and so we cannot say a creator's actions are bad, because to say that they are bad would posit that it has a relation to its creation, and because it's the result of its creation is not up to standard, the creator is bad. But this is also question begging against those who believe in a good God, so you need to justify that. And also there is an argument that could be made to say that moral categories do apply to a creator. Here's one argument. 1. If a world creator exists, then it is likely that it knows its effects, such as the emergence of moral beings. 2. If a maker knows about the emergence of moral beings, it is likely that moral categories apply to it. And so 3. If a world maker exists, moral categories likely apply. So, for premise 1, it can be argued that it ought to be conscious and have a mind, right, as we just did in the past. And it's hard to see how actions could be unintentional, given that it is a mind, and an immaterial mind, right? It just, how would that even work in the first place? Since it would have to accidentally do things, and that seems really ad hoc and unlikely. Premise 2. Scientists have obligations to, well, dog-faced monkeys that they create in a lab, such as not torture them. And so, like scientists, the creator, has obligations because it knows what it does and makes it accountable. You might object that divine agency is not really comparable to human agency, but divine agency, insofar as it involves being a creator and a designer, is related to human agency, and so they have that in common, and that's what makes them susceptible to moral categories. And so, the question could be asked, what difference between the two could make the creator not have moral categories applied to it? And so, yeah. Now you might think, what if the creator was wicked? So, the book goes back to Hume's Philo, and in there he offers 4 options for what the first causes could be like. They could be wholly good, wholly evil, both evil and good, and amoral. Hume takes the 4th option to be the most plausible, but the arguments we have shown against them make it seem more implausible than Hume thinks. And for the second, we could say that the uniformity of laws in creation makes it implausible. What if if there was some good aspect and bad aspect of it, it seems like there might be intention, right? Furthermore, good eventually triumphs over evil, and we'll go into that later. But basically, if good is not grounded in evil, and evil is grounded in good, in a sense, or the privation of good, it cannot independently exist, then it seems that good would eventually triumph over bad, and thus it wouldn't be stable. Also, from mixed phenomena, right, when you see both good and bad, you cannot really conclude the first or second option. You need to be agnostic about it, and thus we need to look into revelation for further conclusions, as the book says cheekily. And now you might ask, how can good exist in a world with evil? Alright, if you were trying to make it the opposite of a theodicy, like I think they call it cacodynomy, something like that. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but where you have to explain why good exists with an evil creator. One thing you could posit is that good is a privation of evil, and that's why good exists. But the book says that, well, no, this seems very implausible, because good can stand without reference to evil, and evil can't. Moral theorists and philosophers before theorists propose this, and I mean, it seems like a pretty widespread belief that good is not a privation of evil. Now, you might ask if good could be like a reward for evil. Well, I mean, we don't really see evil generally producing good and pleasures, so it's implausible. And so furthermore, pleasures seem to complete a proper act. They seem to be for a proper act, if you take an Aristotelian sort of view. And so, yeah. Now you might say that the world is ugly, and so the creator cannot be good, and so therefore it must be evil. Like, it's not really a theodicy; it just shows like an argument. But this seems questionable because even in a bad world, there is complexity, right? And when there's complexity, there's order, and where there's order, beauty follows. And so the world does not seem ugly, even though it is bad. Maybe you could apply Plantinga's free will defense for an evil creator. But there are two symmetry breakers for this, right? First, free will seems to be an intrinsically good thing. And second, as I've mentioned previously, good does not seem to dissipate like evil does. It can be redeemed. An evil action can be redeemed later on, right? You can be forgiven for it. A good action, you don't really like, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't get unforgiven or something like that. And maybe you could posit that a creator punishes good people, and so good exists for the sake of punishment. But traditionally, free will defense excludes God's good action when weighing up the world, and so it doesn't seem that you should, add the creator's action into it. And furthermore, it seems that there's an intelligibility issue, right? Evil can be for a greater good, but good for a greater evil, that seems unintelligible, right? And I mean, the reason for that is you can still have evil without this greater good. It doesn't seem like there's you can still have punishment without this good, right? Like this sort of intuition that it doesn't really make sense that way. And so you might say that the creator does lack intelligibility, but if the creator does lack intelligibility, then it seems much less, or not much less, but at least less likely than the other options on the table. There might be something missing though, right? Even if you excluded that the creator was wicked or amoral, it still seems like some rule is broken in creation, right? The world does not seem up to standard. And now you might say that revelation works, but this seems to involve consequentialism, right? Or, if you think that it involves compensation, and compensation does seem to involve consequentialism, then wouldn't this also involve consequentialism? And also, wouldn't such a creator create the best of all possible worlds, or at least a better world than this? And so, can revelations really handle this? It seems like a big issue. So, and it also seems that the world creator intends suffering, right? Because the world creator is a mind, and so it creates a world with suffering. But does that mean it intended wrongdoing, though? Because if it intended wrongdoing, then yes, we would say that this world creator cannot be good. There seems to be a third option, though. The world creator permits, but does not intend evil or a wrongdoing, like when a mother permits his son to steal a snack, but she doesn't intend him to. He merely allows it, right, through free will. Now, you might argue that if a creator knows the consequences of its actions, would it not follow that a creator intended wrongdoing? Well, consider an injured man who intends to not limp when escaping a bear, right? So he'll know he knows he will limp, but he intends not to limp. And I mean, so that seems to be a direct counterexample to this. And the more general principle is that if A is necessary for B, intending B does not entail intending A. Right? A limp is necessary for an old man to escape, but it is not intended to. It's not intended by the old man. After all, he wants to escape, so he doesn't really want to limp. And so a better way of going about saying what it means to intend something is that intention involves the means for something else. So in this case, movement is a means for escaping. So that is intended insofar as the man intends to escape. Now on to consequentialism. So wouldn't compensation be consequentialist, as I just mentioned? So, I mean, take Kant, for example. Kant argued that doing what is good for the sake of another is bad, and so isn't knowing the goods of virtue bad when it comes to revelation, right? The first thing to note is that people forget about it a lot of the time, right? I mean, you hear people saying, "You're a Christian, remember?" Stuff like that. And it also seems prone to counterexamples, for example, relationships for the sake of children, right? That just seems good. And it also is for the sake of another, so is that not a counterexample? And it seems impossible to, not know the goods of virtue, because, for example, you might think of someone dying, and you might think about what that means to you to lose someone, and that involves consequences. In fact, Kant used the notion of goods following moral actions to argue for an afterlife, where there is compensation. Kant's argument for this sort of morality for the sake of itself is unclear. One of the clear ways he does present it is in another book, where he argues that morals based on one's own comfort, perfection, and concern for others don't work, and thus, since all the options are left out, morals have no end. So for one's own comfort, he would say that involves egoism, and, well, egoism does not seem like a plausible good at all. So you might say it's for one's own perfections, and he distinguishes between two types of perfections, natural perfections and moral perfections. He argues that natural perfections can be misused, such as when you, well, let's say, I don't know, get strong, or, yes, get fit. You can misuse that a lot. Or moral perfections. But moral perfections, that seems to involve a tautology, or a redundancy, so that doesn't really solve anything. And concern for others falls into the two reasons above, because, well, it could seem like an egoistic thing, or it could be misused, right? And also, I mean, if it's a natural perfection, and if it's a moral perfection, then, I mean, it doesn't seem to like do any work there. The first thing to know is that Kant's argument left out supernatural perfection. So, as Aquinas noted, that the fullest perfection requires an attendant affection for the highest objects. So, if such were a real natural perfection, then it cannot be misused, right? Such a thing does not seem to be able to be misused at all. Also, note that not every natural perfection can be misused. For example, take the disposition for real friendship. Real friendship actually involves real trustworthiness, and real trustworthiness cannot be misused by the bearer, perhaps by others. So, I mean, take for example, right? People try to get information out of you, or people try to, I don't know, take advantage of you. That does not seem to be something that where you misused your trustworthiness. Rather, that seems to be a case where someone else misused your trustworthiness. And so it seems that, in short, natural perfections can presuppose moral ones. So, and because they are not moral perfections in themselves, This is not a circular sort of thing. And also, it's quite interesting that Kant thinks that freedom is an end of itself, at least according to Geyer. And so, in this case, categorical imperatives becomes the means subordinated to the end of freedom. And that means he's not really that much different from Aquinas or from Aristotle. And I mean, so what did he really do there? And what justifies his end is just practical considerations. There's not really any substantial sort of justification. And so it also leaves the possibility of other ends, such as those described in Revelation. And now on to world grading. So the two objections from world grading are that we have a standard and this world fails to be one that a good creator would create, and the second, we don't know the standard for a good world, but it still seems bad for a good world creator to create. So there's two types of ways you can grade worlds. One is through a eudaimonistic means. This would involve taking into consideration the states of individuals. This would involve some sort of counterintuitive way of thinking about happiness, where happiness can be summed, right? And also there's intuitions where we might think that doing things for the greater good is not preferable. And insofar as you think that is intuitive, then this sort of world grading does not seem plausible. Furthermore, if we value the happiness of rational creatures over that of non-rational creatures, I mean, what about a world where the creator, who is also rational, is infinitely happy while pursuing their desires, which are not really, good, right? Like, I don't know, massive suffering, if the creator was wicked. So that would not be a plausible sort of way of grading. You might try through aesthetic grading, such as beauty, but I mean, in that case, like, what level would be good enough? What level of beauty? And also, another thing to consider is that if Kant was right that freedom is what gives moral value, it would fail as a world as a whole. Could be still bad even if moral value is high. And so yeah, that's why eudaimonistic grading does not really work that well. So for functional or non-theistic functional grading, where the world itself has some sort of function that it tends towards, and however well it goes and completes that function, the better it is. The first question to ask is, well, I mean, how could the world have an ultimate purpose without a creator, right? Especially given that modern-day physicalists reject teleology. So it seems quite a difficult question to answer. And maybe as a sort of function, you might posit that the world's function is to provide good environment for its creatures. But intuitively, a bad world can still result from this, right? There could be lots of life, but it could be full of suffering. And another way of putting it is that the world as a whole has a purpose only if the parts do, and the parts don't for physicalists, so there's no purpose of the world. And so, like, what kind of how could you say that there is a purpose for the world? You need to justify that the parts have a purpose too. And this is the same sort of argument that Aristotle uses to argue that the whole has a purpose. And you might, as the last consideration the book takes, that the world might be like a sort of organism. That still seems to involve worlds with massive suffering being considered as good, and so it's very, very unintuitive. And how about without a standard, right? You might say that, well, there's just no standard, but we still know that it is bad, right? We already know that without a rigorous standard, that a world without murder is better than one with it. And while that seems true, there are some unclear cases, right? Would a world of peace, forever peace, versus a world with evil and then good overcomes it, be better? Which one would be better, right? People differ on that. And also, good is usually given in context, right? For example, it is good to save a person, but bad that they lose their money. And so, like, how would you judge good in this case? That seems to involve coming up with some sort of standard. And also, another thing to note is that it's really hard to change small aspects of a world with no other changes whatsoever, like the butterfly effect, basically. So seeing what worlds are actually possible is pretty hard. Um, so also, making a part of a world does not necessarily mean the whole is better, because like you might think that a small ugly patch on a ball makes it look nice. Imperfections make it look better, right? So if you don't have a standard, like how would you determine whether it's better or not? Um, yeah. So if you think that the world could be, uh, slightly better, or it could be better than this, it's you need to give extra clarification for it. And so when it comes to needing a criterion, it seems that only that the atheists in this case need a criterion, because the theists don't really have to regard the world as good or evil or good or bad, right? I mean, uh, there is some cases where in Revelation that they say that might say that creation is good, but there's also many other places where they talk about the world as being, a temporary bad one that is set up for the world to come. Um, and so yeah.